Our next presenter is going to be Dr. Scott Stanley. Dr. Stanley is professor at the University of California, Davis. He is internationally acclaimed in the fields of equine pharmacology, analytical chemistry, and anti-doping detection. He's the principal chemist at the Kenneth L. Maddie Equine Analytical Chemistry Laboratory, which is California's official drug testing lab. He is going to share with us the newly introduced British Horse Racing Authority's zero tolerance policy, which has far-reaching effects even into our industry, which I think we all need to be abreast of what's coming. To that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Stanley.
Well, thank you all very much, and I truly do appreciate the invitation to come out and speak to you today. I'm going to try and give some background on some of the work that we've done at UC Davis and also some of the investigations regarding the British Horse Racing Authority's new zero tolerance approach for anabolic steroids. So many of you background, I'm going to talk about hair testing, which is the matrix that they're going to use, a little bit about some of the other testing we've done, blood and urine, over the years for the sales companies, both Fasig-Tipton and for Keeneland, since about 2008. Hold on one second. Okay, I think we're working now. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is just give you a little background on the laboratory that is at UC Davis. It's called the Kenneth L. Maddie Equine Analytical Chemistry Laboratory. Senator Maddie was a state senator. He's also a thoroughbred horseman, and he was fortunate enough for us to have some foresight into putting together a laboratory at UC Davis, where we also have a School of Veterinary Medicine. And the purpose for that laboratory was to answer questions about pharmacology, as well as develop a drug testing program to support the industry in California and provide some additional integrity. The laboratory that we have today has allowed us to answer some of these questions and present a lot of the data that we have. Today I'm going to talk just briefly about the laboratory, then I'm going to get into the British Horse Racing Authority's zero tolerance policy regarding the anabolic steroids, a little brief history about anabolic steroids the last couple of years, some of the difficulties they've had over in Britain, also the UC Davis approach, and we've worked very closely with the lab in Newmarket, England, that does the drug testing for the British Horse Racing Authority, also about other drug coverage that you can get from hair analysis, and then something we'll talk about at the end is segmented analysis, which is what happens if we want to determine what time after administration that the drug was administered. The laboratory that I'm involved with at UC Davis is solely for the purpose of equine pharmacology and anti-doping. We do a lot of drug detection. We do also a lot of research as well. We look at the pharmacokinetics of drugs. We administer drugs to 16 thoroughbred racehorses or retired racehorses that are part of our exercised herd, and we investigate these drugs. You could see the drug clenbuterol, as well as things like erythropoietin and growth hormone that we've worked on over the last number of years to investigate how they might be used properly or abused in racehorses. Part of our program, in addition to my position, is a veterinary pharmacologist. Dr. Heather Knitsch is our equine pharmacologist. She's a DVM, PhD, board-certified clinical veterinary pharmacologist, and she's excellent at getting us the information that we need regarding these drugs, how they're used, what's appropriate use, what the withdrawal times are. She's in charge of the exercised herd. She has a staff of analysts as well as horsemen who handle the horses on a regular basis so that we can implement a program that is very similar to the horses at the racetrack. So the 16 horses that we have are all exercised, and they model what we're analyzing from post-race samples, generally blood and urine. We've also used and implemented a new policy this year to test all of those drug administration trials for hair testing as well. We also have industry and scientific advisory board, and we have an entire School of Veterinary Medicine and faculty and staff there that we can call on if we have additional questions. I thought I'd briefly show you a list of some of the compounds that we're looking for. Just the list, and I'm going to get this wrong. I'll call it your left in this particular, because I've got screens here and here, so I apologize for getting confused. But the first column is anabolic steroids. So just to let you know, that's only a partial list of the anabolic steroids we would look in every sample. I'm sure it's more than most of you thought were out there, but it's less than half of the compounds that we look for on a regular basis. We also look for a variety of other compounds. Beta agonists, drugs like clenbuterol have been used for as a consideration for quarter horses with muscle mass increases, and other compounds that are analgesic properties as well. These are all compounds that we know we can look for in hair samples, and we've looked for them for years, if not decades, for urine and blood samples. The laboratory at UC Davis is the only one in the country that was specifically built for the purpose of equine drug testing. So we're fortunate to have the technology, the layout, the facility to do this work, pretty much like no other laboratory in the U.S. We also have certifications. These are accreditations that show that we're competent to perform these tests, both by an international group as well as a national group, to demonstrate our competency. Why is all that necessary? Well, it's all necessary because Senator Maddie, years ago, decades ago, determined that it was important for racing integrity. Most of the time I talk about this from the standpoint of what racing events are occurring in California as well as in other places. But in this particular venue, I thought I'd talk about sales horses. And I was really surprised when I looked up this material and I found out that the industry as a whole has a gross receipts of $917 million, $100 million, sorry. That's almost $1 billion in sales that has occurred every year, which 430 million of that is just from yearling sales. So there's a huge amount of revenue that's handed around each year just at sales and auction events, such as would occur in this venue on normal basis. We're also trying to protect the industry from major events, things that get a lot of press. The Triple Crown events and the Breeders' Cup. Breeders' Cup Classic is one of the biggest races in the world. Breeders' Cup events have been held in California, and next year Keeneland is going to host those, so you guys will get a first-hand look at what that's like to have a big event like that right here in town. I put down just a couple of records from the horses that have sold in September and November. There certainly have been horses that have sold for more money on this on an individual basis, but these are still very large numbers for individual horses. So our integrity slips around, and it's consistent with whether or not these horses can perform and whether or not they've been raised in an environment and whether or not they're considered to be drug-free, but not only in the United States, but also those that travel outside the United States. This is up there, and this is specific. I wanted to make sure, Jody Huckabee explained to me that we have a lot of students here today. There will be a test afterwards, but only for you guys. Now, this is just to show that it's a very complex process that we're working with anabolic steroids, the feedback mechanisms, the impact of these steroids when they're used. They need to be used in conjunction with and only under the consideration and the direct supervision of a veterinarian, because there's too many exogenous and endogenous components that are changing when you administer a powerful medication like this to a thoroughbred or even a quarter horse or other breeds within the industry. So when they're used without supervision, without people that are knowledgeable as to how they should be used, you can have a lot of detrimental side effects. The compounds that you see in the lower corner there are medications that we've either gotten confiscated or were brought in into the United States illegally. Above that is just to show how the anabolic steroids can bind to the androgen receptor and elicit a response. And the muscle growth is typically what they're looking for here, but also other properties similar to testosterone. All of these compounds are trying to mimic testosterone, but to reduce the aggressive nature that most anabolic steroids like testosterone would produce. And these illegal compounds can be brought in. They still have the same drug that we're looking for on the first list that I showed, so they're readily detectable, but they're not as trackable. So these oftentimes get in the hands of people that aren't professionals, that don't necessarily know exactly what they're doing with this medication. To show you one more step, this is how complicated the steroidogenesis pathway is. There's literally 40 different compounds that are generated through this process, from the metabolism of cholesterol down to the production of testosterone. Many of these compounds have very similar structures. What we in the laboratory have to do is we have to differentiate these endogenous components from the exogenous anabolic steroids. So we need to be able to tell these compounds from the other compounds that we know can be given to a horse to elicit the same response. All right, now just briefly, I was going to go over the situation that occurred just a couple of years ago, or just over a year ago in England. They had a problem with some anabolic steroids that were being brought in and used by trainers under the supervision, in some cases of a veterinarian, but also in some cases not. They had two occurrences. One, a trainer was found to have multiple positives. It was reported that Gerard Butler had a number of findings for the drug anabolic testosterone, and it led back to this particular product. It was called Sungate. Sungate was an Italian anabolic steroid preparation. It has stanozolol, which is a steroid that we're very familiar with, but it was for a treatment we didn't know of before, at least I didn't know of before, which is an interarticular treatment of stanozolol for horses with debilitating joint diseases. In this case, they were administering that for horses in England. They had written it down on their day sheets so that they recorded the information, and it was under the recommendation of a veterinarian. At that time, they had 9 positives from the 28 samples that were tested, and they had a variety of different concentrations, and the trainer had reported those all on his medication sheets. Simultaneously, or very close to the same time, there was another occurrence with the Godolphin stable where they had a number of positives as well. In that case, they initially took 45 samples and had 4 positives. They later came back and took 200 and let me back up one second. One of the things that I wanted to mention on this particular slide, you see the bottom bullet. They were able to match the urine samples and the plasma samples that they took with hair samples, so it corroborated the information. What they didn't do on the second test, they went back and took 203 samples. 11 of those were positive. 3 of the 4 horses that had tested positive before repeated positives for their plasma detection of that drug, meaning that for 3 weeks later, you're still finding 75% of the horses were positive. But they didn't take hair samples that time, so they couldn't corroborate that. These circumstances, I believe, are part of the reasons that it led to this new policy that came out last summer regarding anabolic steroids and a zero tolerance, because they had so much negative publicity from those exposures from those 2 occurrences and a few other trainers that were also involved. The British Horse Racing Authority has responded with a very strong statement that says they're not going to have any anabolic steroids in British horse racing. And through that, they released these policies. And I've underlined a couple of the specific topics, but it's very clear in their minds that horses shall not be administered an anabolic steroid at any point in their life. That's much different than the United States has had before, and certainly different than some veterinarians and some other folks in the U.S. feel that there may be an appropriate reason to use an anabolic steroid as a therapeutic compound. British Horse Racing Authority has said no, they're not going to accept that under any circumstances. And they're using a mandatory stand-down period. And that's terminology that they use. It's not something that I think I fully understood for a little while. Their mandatory stand-down period is 12 months. Now that stand-down period means that you can't train or do anything with that horse during that 12 months. So if a horse is found to have been administered an anabolic steroid, 12 months after that period of time, you can't position that horse or prepare that horse for racing. The reason that they put a 14-month eligibility period is they feel it takes at least 2 months after that period to get the horse ready for performance. So their full period of time is 14 months. from the time a horse was given anabolic steroids until it could be eligible to race again. And then I know that many of you already know that, but that could be a career for a lot of horses. They've also said that horses are eligible to be tested for anabolic steroids at any time. So they can select the horse in training, out of training, when they're in layup, anytime, and they're requiring that the horses be trackable to their location during those periods of time. In addition to that, and this is what makes it a little bit separate, they do distinguish the horses in Great Britain from most of the other horses, and they're saying that those horses have to be registered, but all imported horses must be registered within 3 months of arrival in Britain. They've also said that because of the mirrored policies that they have, horses from Ireland, France, and Germany will be exempt from the importation requirements of other horses. Horses that are running in Great Britain have to be there within 14 days of the event so that they could be tested prior to the event. I think that part of this is unique, and the fact that a lot of the exclusions are really very regional, and they're saying that it's a mirrored policy. But they haven't approached us in the United States to develop a similar policy. So I find it a little curious that we don't have the opportunity to prepare a mirrored policy with them, and I'm hopeful that we can go back and readdress that in the near future so that we can have the same opportunity. So the objectives from here on out is to explain hair testing to you. Because a lot of the anabolic steroids, the only reason that they can even look at a 12-month or 14-month period is because they would apply hair testing in that situation. So I'm going to explain how it works, why it works, what it does, and how that could be used in order to generate or police that policy of a 12-month clearance and a 14-month stand-down period. Traditionally, we've done a lot with urine and blood analysis, and I'll explain how that works. But I can also tell you there's some outside influences as well with hair analysis. And then I'll break it down into different groups that we're looking for, tell you some of the limitations also about hair testing. So for your urine analysis, we can just see most drugs out from any time from 15 minutes after administration. In some cases, we can see drugs out to 30 to 45 days. But most of our compounds are eliminated within 1 to 14 days after administration. Depends a lot on the lipophilicity, the drug characteristics, the depot forms of the drug, etc. For anabolic steroids, those are generally formulated to be there for a longer period of time. So we can see many of those compounds out for days to weeks after administration. In some cases with extended period formulations, we can see it out to a couple of months in a urine sample. But still, that's not near the 14 months or 12-month period they're talking about British Horse Racing Authority. Disadvantages is we have to control temperature, refrigerate, and transport that. That's fairly expensive. But with a minimum withdrawal time, you can see 1 to 14 days, most medications could be used on a horse, and then the horse could compete within a couple of weeks. Hair testing is quite a bit different, and it gets fairly confusing to people. I keep seeing hair follicle testing referred to in some of the literature. We're not testing the follicle, we're actually testing this portion here, the hair shaft. The hair shaft, as the hair grows, actually has its own blood supply, and I'll show you that here in a minute. When the drug gets incorporated into the animal system, whether it's given IV, oral, whether it's given in any other systemic route, it gets into the bloodstream so it can transport to its site of activity. It's that time during the bloodstream it gets incorporated into the hair. Once it's in the hair fiber, it's almost permanently located in there. So for extended period of time, you can see these drug residues in those hair samples. And these are just some brief pictures to show how that works. You can see on this, you can see the epidermis, you can see the hair follicle itself, and then the hair shaft. And you can see at the beginning, the blood supply is actually what delivers the drug into the hair as it's growing. If you have what's called a one-off incident, a single administration of the drug, the hair will continue to grow out as the hair grows out, and you won't see drug evenly distributed through the hair. You'll just see that one segment exposed with the drug. If you have regular use or repeat occurrences, then the entire hair fiber from one end to the other could have drug in it or would have drug in it because of the continued exposure. So that's basically how the concept works. The drug is delivered by the blood into the hair at the follicle, distributed into the hair fiber, and sequestered there for long periods of time. There's a lot of factors that affect that. One of them is hair color. The melanin in the hair, the content of that is also responsible for binding the drug. It's actually what the drug's attached to, so hair color can be a factor in detection of that. Complicated terms like lipophilicity and alkalinization or alkalinity can also be factors. These are basically just how the drug is distributed and what conditions the drug needs for distribution, whether or not they're effectively absorbed into the hair, whether they dissolve in fat, whether they dissolve in oil. It's the same that drugs distributed in multiple compartments. Some drugs are distributed into the fat. If they're distributed into the fat, that'll affect how they're absorbed into the hair. Hair growth rate is also important. This is how we can somewhat equate the time frame from administration if we look at hair growth rate. So we have to understand how long it grows, how fast it grows, whether we're taking body hair, whether it's from the mane, whether it's from the tail. But we do know that it's approximately 2 centimeters per month. So 12 centimeters of hair could give us testing periods out to 6 months. And you could say as long as 24 centimeters of hair could give you testing out as long as a year. Remember what I said earlier, the drug is almost permanently sequestered into the hair fiber. So it is an avenue for us to have a matrix that we can test for a very long period of time for certain drugs. The collection process is pretty simple. We provided some collection materials for some pilot studies at this point. We've done mane and tail hair in part of those processes. The proximal end being closest to the horse is generally cut and marked and then placed into a sealed bag with a barcode label, just as it would any other evidence that we would get from a performance event. We also have to do some hair preparation things. The first thing we do is wash the hair for any external exposure and contamination. Then we have to cut the hair, and then we chemically digest or break down the hair in order to release the drug. To show you some of that, this would be a typical kit for the material. Right now, we don't really have a storage process, so we use containers we use for urine samples. You can see the cup there, also with a barcode label, and I do have a close-up. We barcode label just as we would a urine sample so that we can provide a complete chain of custody on the process with a security bag that can't be opened without cutting it open. The chain of custody on a hair sample would be just the same as it would or a blood or urine. We can trace it back to the individual animal. If need be, we could even do DNA analysis on some of the hair samples to equate back to which animal was responsible for the production of that. We also record additional information that we wouldn't normally. We would record hair color in addition to what we would normally get from a post-race urine or blood sample. And we can track those all back to the source so that we can have a legally defendable chain of custody. This would be an example of one of the hair samples that we would collect from that. You can see this is tail hair. We can also do mane as well. We have not done body hair because it turns over so quickly, it doesn't give us that longevity that we could get from other hair sources. You can see next to that is the hair sample after it's gone through its original preparation. And the original preparation is very simple. We have to cut it down into small pieces so that we can break it down and analyze it. And breaking it down and analyzing it is a lot more laborious and intensive than we would for other matrix like blood and urine. We have these little individual units that we obtain, and it's basically what's called a ball grinder or just a physical degradation where we use this shaker with the beads in it to pulverize the hair. Pulverizing the hair breaks down the fiber and allows us to release the drug that's sequestered in the hair fiber so we can do the analysis. So basically, those little beads inside that chamber pulverizes the hair down so that we get this pulverized hair at the end so that we can extract it and perform our routine processes. It's actually quite a bit more labor intensive than what we've done for for blood and urine. And one of the reasons that we see some limitations coming out of Great Britain, they're very much limiting the number of test samples that they can handle, is because of all the labor involved in handling this. So we could test a lot more blood and urine than we can hair samples at this time. What makes hair much more unique, we've already discussed it, is the longevity of the window of opportunity that we can detect those drugs. In the past, we would say testosterone and stanozolol, we can see at a blood sample probably not more than 30 days. Boldenone, we can see much longer, out to 60 days. But that pales in comparison to how long we can see it in a hair sample. We can also determine whether it's multiple or single administrations. From what I showed you before, the one-off test versus the routine exposure will tell us whether or not it was a single administration or multiple administrations. They're also really actually quite easy to handle. We don't have the shipping problems, we don't have refrigeration problems. We can store the sample for a long period of time. I've gotten a number of people that have approached us already about could we do hair testing for them on their individual animals. And at this point in time, we've not accepted any samples from outside clients, only from our regulatory authorities or some sales companies that we're working for. But you could take a sample now and keep it for months before it's tested, which is a lot different than you could with a blood or urine sample. To give you an example of some of the groups that we've worked on, some of the groups of drugs that we've looked at already, anabolic steroids is certainly the one that we spent the most time on. And you can see the list here of endogenous and exogenous. And I apologize before, I probably should have explained that a little bit better. The endogenous drugs, anabolic steroids, are the ones produced naturally by the horse. And we now know pretty much all of those, and we can regularly determine and separate those from others. Exogenous are ones that are not part of the natural pathway. They're not produced by the horse through any mechanism at all. So these exogenous compounds are anabolic steroids, typically developed for human use, but have gotten into the performance horse market, and also some have been found most often in human athletes, but occasionally popped up in horses as well. You can see the list of some of the compounds that we're routinely testing for now in hair samples. Our list currently, I think, is 68 compounds, 68 anabolic steroids that we're looking for in each sample. In addition to that, hair testing goes well beyond just anabolic steroids. We quickly found that we can test for corticosteroids as well. So these drugs here are typically used for interarticular administrations. Some of them used systemically as well, like dexamethasone and prednisolone. But the compounds like triamcinolone, methylprednisolone, betamethasone, isoflupridone are all used interarticularly. And we've been able to identify methods that we can see drugs administered either way. We can see the systemic administration of dexamethasone. We can also see the interarticular administration of triamcinolone and methylprednisolone. Other compounds that have also come of great interest, primarily to the quarter horse folks that we've been working for, are the beta-2 agonist compounds, specifically clenbuterol. We have some quarter horse industry folks that are very concerned that quarter horses are being administered large doses of clenbuterol as an anabolic effect. We have not demonstrated or seen the science to prove that it's a great anabolic steroid or that works in that fashion, but still we're regulating oftentimes the illegal use and inappropriate administration of high doses, so whether or not it's effective is not really the case. There's also another new group of compounds that fall into this class, or that we've added to this, which are called selective androgen receptor modulators. Again, this will be on the test. The selective androgen receptor modulators that are out there now actually act just like an anabolic steroid. They bind to the receptor, they elicit the response. They don't have a structure or similarity at all to the anabolic steroid. There's a number of those compounds out there that are used for human medicine. I've listed a couple of them that are available now for use in humans, and they'll find their way into our horse market soon enough. Some of them are actually been around for a number of years, and they have been detected already in human athletes. And then this is a group of compounds that I'm actually most worried about. The biopharmaceutical or natural products that are being used and manufactured as a pharmaceutical. You can see an example picture I have of one of those compounds here. The human and equine growth hormone, what's called growth hormone releasing factor 2 and growth hormone releasing factor 6, insulin-like growth factor. All of these compounds are natural products that are part of the growth hormone or muscle building components that are being produced now as pharmaceutical agents available over the internet and other illicit sources. Some of them are real, many of them are bogus, but at the same time they're a big concern because they're not simple detections. They require a lot more unique instrumentation and different approaches for us to be able to quickly identify these compounds. But we feel this may be an emerging market and an area of big concern. One of the things that we've talked about with the clients that we're looking at now is broadening the scope of testing beyond anabolic steroids to include these other growth compounds that may be a big concern if anabolic steroids have a zero tolerance. So our particular workflow in this case is pretty simple. We actually do the disruption. We take 200 milligrams of the hair, and we do all these different analysis on it. It looks really pretty simple on the flow chart. It's a lot of complex analysis. Each one of the instruments you see there, the UPLC, MS, the high-resolution MS, and the GCMS, are all instruments that cost upwards of $300,000. So the technology behind this is very sophisticated, and you can see multiple assays being done in order to cover all of these compounds. So it's not a simple procedure, and it does take quite a bit of time in addition to the labor in itself just to get the hair sample ready. This is one of the instruments that we've used most often. This is a $400,000 mass spectrometer. It actually has high resolution capability. It's advanced enough to detect proteins, do metabolomics, and detect compounds down below 1 part per trillion. So the sensitivity on this and the technology is what's allowing us to do this. If you came to us 10 years ago and said, can you test for these samples in hair? I could say, no, we're not sensitive enough. But now the technology is out there. We can virtually see these compounds at such low levels that we can see even a small exposure over a short period of time. That's why British Horse Racing Authority, that's why our laboratory are capable of pursuing these low levels and concentrations from hair samples. Just to show you that, I actually am just a geek scientist. This is the technology behind what's called the Orbitrap, the main detector. It actually uses a Fourier transfer mechanism in order to detect these peaks, provides a mass to charge ratio. You see the spinning orbits of those molecules going around what's called the Orbitrap. They're ejected out. Fourier transfer is read as a mass spectrometry. That will not be on the test. Okay, so with science, we have limitations as well. Regardless of what we do with that technology, there's certain things that we can't do with a hair sample. So we can't distinguish the exact frequency, the purity of the drug, how often it's used in many cases. We can probably tell that it was used within 30 days or outside of 30 days, whether it was used once or multiple times, but we can't define a lot of that. We can't define route of administration. We'll never be able to tell you whether it was given by IM, oral, or IV routes. Those are things that we can't really determine from any biological sample, blood or urine. And we can't pinpoint the exact administration time. We can give ballpark. What I often do when I have to testify on a court case finding is we're trying to pinpoint whether the drug was given on race day or whether it was given outside of 48 hours. That's about the best we could do. We could say this drug was given inside of 30 days. We could say it's given outside of 60 days. But with a hair sample, that's probably as close as we can get based on the knowledge that we have, how fast hair grows, what we can do with that. So there are some serious limitations as to what we can do and determine exactly those time frames. We've done some work here. You see the drug stanozolol, and that's the one that I alluded to earlier, was in Sungate. This drug recently, some of you may have seen, there was some Maryland horses that were disqualified for having stanozolol. And one of the concerns about this drug, and one reason that that was a big deal, is this drug is no longer commercially available. This drug is only available from veterinary compounders. It is no longer manufactured by a pharmaceutical company. But anyway, we've done some work with this compound. We can see in plasma 18 parts per trillion, picograms per milliliter. The blank plasma does not have a peak in it, and a spike sample we can see as well. So we could easily see 18 parts per trillion in a plasma sample. That's a very low concentration. But plasma, as urine, are constantly turning over the drug. So a week later, 2 weeks later, we're not going to see any of these compound in a blood sample. In a hair sample, we can see it readily after 4 weeks, the stanozolol present in the blood sample. You see the bottom hair sample is definitely positive, a very distinct peak. When we separate it out, you can actually see it's a little cleaner than the background data that we got from the plasma sample. So we can easily see the spike in the positive sample of stanozolol 4 weeks later. Well, the other thing that we know that's not going to change. We will be able to see that 4 weeks after that and 4 weeks after that because it's sequestered inside the hair. Urine sample on that same horse 4 weeks after, sorry, you can't quite see this as well, but we can't determine or identify stanozolol in this horse 4 weeks after it was administered the stanozolol. So the urine sample is not as effective for long-term detection of that compound. The other thing that I did want to briefly go over is a little bit of the segment analysis component. It's been discussed a little bit, but it's not something that is routine yet. The segmented analysis, if you look at a hair fiber, just a single fiber, and you look at its growth over a 6-month period, it would be about this length. We can then cut it down into segments. We can partition that into 2-week segments, or we could do it into month segments so that we could follow that hair and discern stuff from it. If we take that 2-week segment, or we take a small segment of that, we find drug in that hair sample, we can say it was administered within 30 or 60 days. If we segment the rest of the hair after that and find no drug, then we can say the drug was not given multiple times, it was not given over a period of time. If I back up and we had 2 different exposures during this segment, we wouldn't be able to discern that. If we had multiple exposures, say in segment 2, 3, or 4, we would be able to determine that. So we can gain additional information from doing segment analysis that'll answer questions regarding how long the drug was administered, how frequently the drug was administered, and what does that mean to us. We can also then apply parameters to how long the animal would have to be withdrawn from racing in order to from competition in order to clear this drug under the regulatory authority. So just to show you some of this, if we do this on a horse that was treated multiple times with a compound, we would see the segment analysis at the bottom being the proximal, the one closest to the time, or closest growth to the hair, and then distal being the longest one. You see the concentration would increase if the horse was exposed multiple periods of time. So if we're just testing the one sample collectively, we just get one peak. If we segment it, we can answer multiple questions. All right, now this is my conclusion slide. I have a lot of other analytical data that I'll hold back because I know it's the afternoon, you just ate, I don't want anybody nodding off, but I do want to, there will be a lot of time for answering questions, but I want to summarize not only the information, but also talk about from a consignment standpoint, from a sales company standpoint, from sellers, from a buyer's perspective, the biggest concerns that we all have that have been just talking about this is the legal elements, policies that need to be implemented, how they're going to be implemented, protecting the seller, protecting the buyer, getting the proper rules in place. We are not there with all of those policies just yet for hair testing. We can say that we can get a legitimate sample. We can say that we can have a solid chain of custody. But exactly how to police this from a regulatory standpoint hasn't been determined by the British Horse Racing Authority, by their legal side, as well as the consigners, and certainly not in the United States. So this is developing on a very rapid basis, but I can tell you that they're planning to make this policy effective in March. So we're going to have to figure that out fairly quickly. What we do know is they've implemented a zero tolerance policy basically for all the horses imported into England from North America. The anabolic steroids that are still a concern. We still see those. The Maryland examples of just the last couple of weeks show us that anabolic steroids are still being used. We occasionally see those in the clients that we test for. They're not frequently administered in racehorses in our jurisdictions, but I think in other parts of the country they are. Hair testing gives us that longevity that we don't have with a blood or urine sample. We can see that compound for far longer in a hair sample than we will in a biological sample that's constantly turning over. We can routinely test with the technology that we have at very low levels for long periods of time. We've developed those for urine and blood analysis. We apply those in hair analysis, and it just expands our capability in the length in which we can see those. Parts per trillion are routine. When I started in the industry over 20 years ago, we could see a few drugs down in the parts per billion. Well, a part per trillion is 1,000 times less than that, and we can do that very efficiently on an everyday basis. And then the other component is segmented analysis. We can use that to our advantage. So one thing, and I wanted to back up just a second and go back to segmented analysis. The one thing I forgot to say on the segmented analysis is it's still 4 times more work for us. If we did a segment, we took that hair and we broke it into 4 parts, it's 4 times more work to get that answer. So there are costs, there are time-consuming requirements to doing all this additional work that we haven't factored in as well either. So there are benefits and timelines that we can get from administrations from segmented analysis, but at additional cost and additional time constraints as well. I also wanted to acknowledge a lot of the people that we've been working with that have supported this, both the California, New Mexico Racing Commissions, the Jockey Club, Breeders' Cup, certainly Keeneland and Fasig-Tipton, American Quarter Horse Association, Thoroughbred Owners of California, Thoroughbred Trainers of California, Pacific Quarter Horse Association, Racing Medication Testing Consortium, and the Racing Association Commissioners International. So yes, I do know what all those acronyms stand for. The other thing that I do want to bring up is that we're in pursuit of accreditation for this as well. So it is something that's going to be, the testing itself will be certified as well. So there's a lot of questions I often get asked about, well, how do we know this testing is accurate? We do have outside certification that will investigate and authorize us to do this. We've worked very closely. I actually sent somebody from my laboratory over to England for a week to work with them on getting up to speed on how they're doing their hair analysis. We are currently the only lab in the country that's doing this type of analysis, but we're hoping to expand that because we will need multiple laboratories doing this if we're going to be able to provide this as a routine testing format. So I did want to leave lots of time for question and discussion today because, as I understand from a number of people, there are a lot of concerns about how this may or may not affect the industry. I think it's certainly going to affect the racing industry and certainly the sales companies very significantly and very soon.
So I'd like to thank Dr. Stanley. We'll open up the floor now for any questioning. I know there's some strategically placed mics around, so please step forward.
The other thing I'm going to say right now is don't be shy. If you have this question, someone else has it as well. There are no dumb questions. This is a difficult subject, and a lot of people are looking for what the next step is. So seriously, this is something that, this is the perfect time to ask a question so that, and I'm not the only one that can answer. There's a lot of other people in this audience that I've been talking to over the last several months that can participate and assist in answering and understanding how to apply these rules. I see Dr. Burke is already ready to go.
Okay, Jane?
I have a question. If you would purchase a horse here at Keeneland and you wanted to send this horse to England to race, would I call you to test this horse, the hair sample, before I send it and find out somewhere along the line it might have had a...
So that's certainly one of the things that we wanted to do. One of the things that the discussions I had with folks at Fasig-Tipton, the folks that I talked to at Keeneland, the folks that we talked to, Kentucky Thoroughbred Owners, Thoroughbred Breeders Groups, is to make sure that we can get ahead of this rather than be behind it. So the concept is so that horses, all of them if we could, but certainly the vast majority, would get tested before they're shipped overseas, before they're tested in England, to make certain that we're abiding by their new regulation and give the buyer or the seller the confidence. We've even discussed things like a pre-certification program that would allow someone that was hoping to sell a horse into an overseas market to certify the horse has been tested before it was auctioned. So I think there's a lot of possibilities for that, yet to be determined exactly what we can and what's the most appropriate way to go. But certainly the idea is to protect everybody involved, to make sure that the horse is meeting this standard of zero tolerance to the best of the abilities of the laboratory and certainly the sales companies.
Headley? Is there an estimated cost that you have an idea about at the moment?
No, we don't. We don't have an estimated cost right now. We've worked with some numbers at this point, but what we don't know is the turnaround time, expectations, and needs. We think we need to increase that substantially, and with that may come additional cost. So we're looking at probably absolutely no less than $500 for the person requesting the test, and it may be slightly more than that.
Scott, you had mentioned that this is going to take effect in March of this year, and let's just say at a 2-year-old in training sale that there's going to be some horses that would be, because of pedigree and performance considerations, might end up being interesting to the Europeans. How are you, and what kind of conversations have the sales companies had with consigners to prepare them for this, and with the nuances of it, like turnaround time for the testing, because these sales, this whole process takes place within a period of days as far as the evaluation of the horse, the desirability of it for those people, and then the actual purchase?
So I'll try and answer all that. I remember, I think it was in 2008, had a meeting with some of the folks in Keeneland. I believe that year in September they sold 5,555 yearlings in 3 weeks. So we wanted to be able to test all of those if it was necessary. So we did develop technology that can rapidly analyze the samples. We have that in place now. We can rapidly analyze samples. The problem is getting samples, working through the samples, prepping the samples, and then doing the analysis necessary takes more time than it would with a blood sample. So we have some limitations on that, getting fast turnaround times. We've also had some additional discussions regarding what would happen with 2-year-olds in training, the policy implementation. British Horse Racing Authority initially said that was going to be a January start date. January would start at the beginning of the year, 2015. They then postponed it to March of 2015. I still think that they're also working with how this is going to be applied. I've seen discussions and communications and been involved with on, what happens pre-March 1st versus post-March 1st. What if the horses treated at the end of 2014? Are they still being applied the rules from 2015? There's still discussion going on. It's not defined. We don't know exactly how they're going to apply all of this, but we have to go with the assumption that it is a zero tolerance as of March 15th, regardless of when that may have been administered. So there's a concept that a horse that's purchased in a 2-year-old training event or any other sale would then go over there and be tested immediately and met with a zero tolerance requirement. I don't know the sanction. I don't know exactly, other than the horse would be prohibited from competing.
Clenbuterol or Venopoman, a lot of times that's used for sick foals and everything. Would that be something that would fall in under the anabolic steroid zero tolerance?
I believe we ask, and that has not been answered. I don't believe right now that it would be considered an anabolic steroid by British Horse Racing Authority. It certainly is being perceived that way by much of the quarter horse industry right now. So they put down the recommendation of basically a zero tolerance for clenbuterol in hair samples for California quarter horse racing. AQHA is also looking at the same thing.
Is that detectable? Say you have a young foal, 3-4 months old, that you give it a clenbuterol or something to pick it up, and then as a yearling it's tested. Can you pick that up a year later?
We don't know so to be honest, we don't know the exact detection times for hair samples on most of these compounds. But yeah, we can see clenbuterol in hair for a very long time. The longevity studies that we would need, we just haven't had time to do them. But I would say very likely we would see it after a year.
Could you expand on the idea of pre-certification? Is that something that's been discussed with European Breeders' Fund, for example?
So we have not had the level of communication that I would like between British Horse Racing Authority and the U.S. So I'd like to see us be able to have more of an open line of communication. I believe at this time that they're certainly not going to prohibit us from doing testing, but I don't believe that they're going to approve a certification that's not done at their own lab. So I think it would have to be done here and then would have to be done over there.
Does the British Horse Racing Board, are they going to utilize the hair testing analysis, or are they just using blood tests?
They've been very vague on that, to be honest. Their policy does not say hair testing, but the reality says is if you're going to look at that period of time, that you could only do that with hair matrix. So they have not specified that they would do blood, urine, or what. But you can deduce from the timeline that they're using that would, in order to meet that timeline, it would have to be hair analysis.
From a consignor's standpoint, selling the horse at the sale, say a European purchaser buys the horse and is planning on taking it back to Europe, where does the liability stand? So one would presume they're going to have the horse tested after they purchase it. Moving forward, is that a turnback? Bain, that's probably a question for you, but...
Right now, no, because the horse would be sold under said company's conditions of sale.
Question then is that going to change moving forward?
As Dr. Stanley has said, a lot of the horse racing policy is very ambiguous at this point. We don't know a whole lot about it. We're still very uncertain on the funding of how they're going to do all this testing. And so the best we can do is service the majority of the market that we currently sell to, which is a North American market. One of the reasons of having Dr. Stanley here today is to make everybody aware of the process and what is on the horizon and the steps that we are probably going to have to take in the future to be able to service that smaller segment of the market that we do sell to.
Okay.
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
When the steroids are administered via testing hair, the earlier the steroids administered, the longer out in the tip of the hair it'll be. So when you're testing the hair, how do you know if you're testing the tip of the hair or the base of the hair?
As we were saying, so the hair is cut from the proximal end closest to the horse. What we have done is started to mark that end. Basically, we tie that end so that we know which was proximal, which was distal. It's actually pretty easy to tell as well because all the hair is even on one end and uneven on the other end on a hair or a main sample. So it's pretty easy to observe that, but we're starting to mark which end was proximal so that we know which end to start at for segment analysis. One of the other things that we don't know as well, and I don't think I mentioned this, but we are able to see a lot of other compounds as we listed on that. We don't know what British horse racing is going to do with corticosteroids, with other compounds. They're saying zero tolerance for anabolic steroids, but we don't know exactly what approach or what concern or what regulation they may apply to other medications that could be found in these hair samples. Things like clenbuterol, corticosteroids, other things that can be detected. They have not come forward to say if they're going to restrict, regulate, or have policies on those, or if it's just for anabolic steroids. And as I said, the anabolic steroid list alone is about 70 drugs. So there's a lot of compounds to look for just in that alone.
There has been some random testing on yearlings done. Do you have any results? I mean, how big of a problem do we have?
We don't have those results. Those results haven't been reported back just yet. We're still working through that data to see. I think that once that's all done, it will be shared with the local community. I just don't know in what format and what time. Apologize for that.
Any further questions? Okay. Dr. Stanley, we appreciate your time today.